This is a bit of an odd video for me to make since I don't usually comment on other people's theories on possible future chapters of Dead by Daylight, but I was asked my opinion about Pixel Bush Entertainment's theory and analysis on whether or not Resident Evil would work in Dead by Daylight. Since that video, an actual announcement that a Resident Evil chapter is coming to the game, so, well, obviously the answer to that is yeah. But even if that announcement hadn't happened, I still would have given that question an answer of, well, yeah. There is absolutely nothing within the Resident Evil series that would prevent a character and killer from being added into Dead by Daylight, except for licensing issues, of course. But I was still asked to take a look at the analysis and give my own feelings on the topic. And since my own Resident Evil 3 What If video is mostly written, and I no longer have any real worry that anything I hear in their video will influence it, I feel that it's safe to take a look at it and say what I think. So, after watching it, which if you haven't, I would recommend doing so first by following the link down below to their video and to their own YouTube channel, I will say that there are a lot of points here that I understand, but I kinda disagree on a lot that was said. Now, I don't want to say that Pixel Bush is wrong, because a lot of this is just personal opinion, and in this particular circumstance, their opinion and my opinion tend to clash. Now, they went through each major part of what goes into a chapter: survivor, killer, and location, though location was kind of short and at the very end. And their first part of the video I really don't have much to say about. They argued that Chris and Jill would probably be the best representation for survivors in the series, and that's perfectly fine. They are the two original protagonists for the series, and either or both of them would be good representation. What I primarily disagree with is their opinions on who could and could not work as a killer for Dead by Daylight. Primarily the argument that the early BOWs in the games shouldn't be added. So the first argument here is that Nemesis or the Tyrant or Mr. X simply couldn't work because they have virtually zero personality, and in the case of the Nemesis, without Jill, he has no real agency in the overarching story. Which I'm not going to disagree about these individual points, just their outcome. Nemesis is essentially a brainless, well, he's not completely brainless, he's actually relatively smart compared to the other BOWs in the series, but a boogeyman that sole purpose is to hunt down the members of STARS. Mr. X is very similar in this regard, as his goal is to either obtain Sherry's locket, which has the G-Virus sample in the original Resident Evil 2, or, well, really just go around killing people in the remake. I want to make it clear that I do somewhat agree that taking these characters out of their environment wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense because of the way they were created. And my reply to that is, so what? It's not like this is the first time that Behavior has taken a character that theoretically shouldn't have any motivation to kill for the entity, and does anyway. Quite a few killers shouldn't have any reason to do what it wants, but they do. If you want an example, we can take a good look at Resident Evil's psychologically twisted rival, Silent Hill, and their own boogeyman that has cast a shadow over the series for years, the Red Pyramid thing. Now, I am going to go on a bit of a tangent here, and this tangent will have spoilers for Silent Hill 2, so if you don't want to get yourself spoiled, skip to here. It will lessen your understanding of my argument, but Silent Hill 2 is such a good game that I don't think it should be spoiled for you unless you know that you're never going to play it. So, in the world that Silent Hill exists, the Red Pyramid thing existing to be taken by the entity doesn't make any sort of sense. The reason for this is that it has only one purpose, and that is to punish the person that involuntarily created it. That person is James Sunderland. Without James, this creature doesn't have a reason to exist. When James decided he no longer needed to be punished for his sins, it kills itself because its very reason for existing is gone. With that being said, versions similar to this creature have appeared in other games and the movies again and again, but they're never the same creature. Also, their inclusion tends to be divisive amongst fans, but we're not going into that right now. So the fact that Behavior decided to use this specific creature and put them into Dead by Daylight doesn't make any sense, as without James, it shouldn't exist either. Now, what I said may make it sound like I'm mad at Dead by Daylight and Behavior for what they did with the character, and that simply isn't so. I get that most people don't fully understand how Silent Hill is supposed to work, and the games that came after Team Silent left is somewhat evidence of that. But when Behavior modified the character's roots so that it would better fit into the story, I just kinda rolled with it, and that's because when you get down to it, it doesn't really matter. Having these characters and locations in Dead by Daylight is self-indulgent fan service at its finest. When you take out the gameplay, Dead by Daylight has essentially become one giant love letter to horror in all its different forms. So the argument that Mr. X, Nemesis, Alexia Ashford, etc., wouldn't fit because the setting of Dead by Daylight doesn't make sense for them to, well, that simply doesn't matter at all. None of the characters here fit together, not even the characters made for the game. Having a plague-ridden high priestess or a self-indulgent pop star running through a cornfield to chase down a German architect doesn't make sense. But it's in the game. Why not a dream demon? Why not a psychological manifestation of things I won't even start to try to explain in this video? Why not a biological weapon that was originally made to hunt down a specific set of people? The reasoning can be flimsy as paper, and it won't matter, because in the end, this game isn't canon to those other games and film properties. It's a story all its own. Plus, it's been written in a way that if something unusual happens, it can always be answered with, because a wizard did it. With that said, we do come to an argument about powers. I'm a bit torn on this one, as I feel that each killer should bring something new and unique into the game, which may not happen if you have a character like Mr. X, but based on past killers, that isn't always the case, as there are several different characters that have somewhat similar abilities. For instance, take the latest killer into account. The trickster throws knives at survivors, and after enough knives hit, the survivor will be damaged. Fundamentally, it's very similar to how the Huntress works, and while she only has to hit one projectile to damage the survivor, they generally follow the same principle. So while I wouldn't necessarily want to see this, I could see the Tyrant being a killer brought into the game where it rushes at survivors similar to the Demogorgon. I wouldn't want it, but I could see it being done. For the Nemesis in particular, well, I have my own thoughts on that, though Pixel did point out that there is something that could make it unique, which, funnily enough, my idea had something to do with that, but I'll go through that in my what if video. Pixel goes on to mention that their idea for killer representing Resident Evil would be Jack Baker from Resident Evil 7, which I'll admit is a choice. All kidding aside, I can completely see this being a character that they might add into the game, as he was basically the face of Resident Evil 7. What I disagree with, however, is the idea that he fits better due to his role in Resident Evil 7 and the type of horror that he represents. Generally, the character's personality isn't all that important, as all characters that exist in the game are kind of watered down versions of themselves. I mean, only 3 playable characters actually talk in the entire game, and that's Ash, the Plague, and the Trickster. I was also originally going to disagree with the idea that Jack could use his connection to the mold as part of his power, since he never really uses these abilities in-game, minus to heal himself and a couple of horrifying transformations later on. But I thought about it, and the Executioner's abilities have nothing really to do with him either, as at no point in Silent Hill 2 does he create a trail in the ground or send a wave out to hit James. So with that in mind, that's not really a debate worth having. Now, I'm not saying that Jack shouldn't be put in the game, as I'm most definitely not qualified to say that. What I am saying is that he's not necessarily better suited to the game based off of the information and the argument presented. The statement provided is excellent information as to why Jack Baker works as a character, but not necessarily why he's a better addition to the roster than anyone else. Now, the next part of this is just my opinion, but it seems like Pixelbush has a real reverence for Resident Evil 7, which is fine. The game revitalized the brand similar to how Resident Evil 4 did. But I would argue that relying on Resident Evil 7 as too much of the inspiration for the chapter would be somewhat of a huge misstep. The reason for this is that, considering the lore and all of the games that have come before it, focusing too heavy on 7 would undoubtedly anger longtime fans of the series that have been around since the early titles, or who have latched onto the series along the way. Basically what I'm saying is that focusing on Resident Evil 7 alone is going to piss people off. Granted, it's the internet, so anything is going to piss people off. This video is going to piss people off even though that's not the intention. Now, I've gone ahead and spent so much of this video talking about why I don't think Pixelbush's reasonings make sense for saying certain characters should or shouldn't be a part of the Dead by Daylight series, without mentioning some of my own ideas, and I shouldn't be willing to criticize someone else's point of view without being willing to put my own on the table. I think it's fair to say that I'd be more than happy to have Jill Valentine as our survivor, Nemesis as our killer, and the Raccoon City RPD as our new... crap, I gave away my Resident Evil what if. Oh well. But if I'm completely honest, I don't think that's how it's going to play out, even if that would make me happiest. If we go back to last year's anniversary, the Silent Hill chapter did something that might be a little bit unexpected. For its map, it chose Midwich Elementary. For its killer, it chose the red pyramid thing under the fan named Pyramid Head. And lastly, it chose Cheryl/Heather Mason as its survivor. Now, why this is interesting is that none of these three things are actually connected to each other. Not at all. Neither Cheryl nor Pyramid Head ever meet, as they are part of different games. Nor do either of them ever go to Midwich Elementary School in the other world. Well, Alessa sort of does, but never mind, that's getting in too deep. So, with each of these things not connected to each other, why choose these three specific aspects to put into the game? Well, look at it in a different way. These three aspects together represent the first three games in the Silent Hill series. Three games that virtually no one contests deserve the Silent Hill moniker. Midwich is the first major destination that Harry Mason has to go to in the first game, where hints of what is happening slowly begin to rear their head. Pyramid Head is the ever-present Punisher for James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2, and iconic to the series. And Cheryl is arguably the most important character in the series, as, while it wasn't intentional, she is partially responsible for why the town is as messed up as it is. But even still, she only shows up as she is in the third game. Mostly. These three aspects are representations of all three of the original trilogy. So while they aren't directly connected in any particular title, together they highlight Silent Hill's heyday. While some future titles are considered good games, there is always an argument on whether or not they should be considered part of the Silent Hill mythology. But with these three, there is no doubt. Now, Resident Evil doesn't have to tiptoe quite as much due to just about every game in the franchise being considered part of the canon, for better or worse. So the vast majority of the games are up for representation. With that said, I don't think they're going to pull all aspects from the same game. Instead, I think they might do something similar to what they did with the Silent Hill chapter, and pull various aspects from the different eras of Resident Evil. There aren't exact terms for what these eras are called, so you'll have to do with my approximation of what they are. First, you have the survival horror era. This starts from the original Resident Evil and extends all the way up to Code Veronica. Though, if you want to be exact, the last games in this era would actually be Resident Evil Dead Aim or Resident Evil 0. The next era would be the action era, brought on by one of the fan-favorite games, Resident Evil 4. This lasted pretty much until Resident Evil 6, but it still stuck around for a bit with the Revelation series, though at that point the intention was actually to course-correct the tone of the series. Then, finally, we come across the Rebirth era, starting with Resident Evil 7. This is the era we are currently in, and it contains 7, the remakes of 2 and 3, as well as the upcoming Resident Evil 8. I mention this all because my guess here is that we are going to get one survivor, location, and killer pulled from each of these eras. Now this might be a bit hard to qualify since for the most part, most characters in the franchise have existed in multiple of these eras, but barring a few exceptions, they generally represent one era or another. So if I were to guess what these representations would be, for the survival era, we've got the classic survivors Jill and Chris, who for the most part encapsulate what the survival horror era was, with Jill being the standout in this case, as she was one of the two main protagonists in Resident Evil 1, and the main character in Resident Evil 3. Chris, similarly, is also a main character in 1, and the latter half of Code Veronica. I would also consider Claire Redfield in this category, as, though, like Jill, she shows up in the action area, neither of them were focused on as heavily as they were in the earlier titles. I wouldn't consider Leon as much for this era, because while he is a fan-favorite character, a lot of that fandom came after he got a bit of a makeover in the action era. For iconic locations, I'm guessing they would have to choose from the mansion in Resident Evil 1, the RPD from Resident Evil 2 and 3, or the clock tower from 3. If a killer is pulled from this era, my assumption is that they're going to go with the T-002 Tyrant from 1, the T-003 known as Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, or Nemesis from, well, 3. If we move on to the action era for survivors, I'm actually kind of adding Chris again, as though he is a main part of the survival horror era, he basically became a new person in the action era with his roided out muscles and his slightly too tight shirts. The action era is also where Leon got a lot of his personality in the fandom, so I will consider him a major part of this era as well. Also, while I don't think either of them are as prominent as Leon or Chris, I would also like to throw a bit of a curveball in and consider Jake Mueller or Sherry Birkin for this era, as in an odd way, they kind of represent a lot of what happened at this time. For killers, well, this is where this era struggles, as there are very few prominent creatures and characters that are memorable. I suppose you could have Dr. Salvador from Resident Evil 4, but I'm pretty sure the backlash would be immediate and harsh. Wesker, I just really hope they don't choose Wesker either. I'm fine with him being a fighter in Marvel vs. Capcom, but I think that's where he should stay. For locations, I mean, there is only one that keeps coming back to me over and over, and that's the village from Resident Evil 3. It's all but tailor-made to be a Dead by Daylight map, and I think if something were to be pulled from the action era, it would be this. Finally, we have the Rebirth era. For survivors, we have Ethan Winters and I guess maybe Mia or Zoe Baker, but really the representation for this is Ethan if we're gonna take a survivor. For killers, I'd have to say that, as Pixelbush said, Jack is pretty much the choice for this era, though I'm certain that very few people will complain if we get some vamp dommy mommy action. And no, after seeing her in game, I don't think her height is going to be too much of an issue during chases. Despite these two contenders, I don't think that we should overlook Dark Horse and Marguerite Baker either, who, sadly, I don't think got enough screen time in Resident Evil 7, but that's just my opinion. Locations for this era are somewhat limited so far, but the Baker residence sounds like a decent choice, but Castle Dimitris in Resident Evil 8 may make a surprise appearance. Never know. So there you are, my personal opinion of what is likely to make an appearance in a Resident Evil chapter of Dead by Daylight. Now, I won't pretend that I know which combination of these might make it into the game, or if any of them will, but I felt it was only fair to put my own opinions on the line. And if you don't like my choices, well, don't worry, because we're all probably going to be disappointed when the chapter ends up being about the Resident Evil movies anyway. Alice, anyone?
Well, me.
I really hope I didn't just jinx that. Hey, so thank you if you made it this far. I know this isn't really the type of content that I usually put out, but if you liked it, please let me know down below with a like and subscribe if you feel like it. No, you don't have to. I'd like it if you did, but you don't have to. But please do. Also, if you'd like to contact me in any way, you can access my Twitter and Discord down below. Also, down there's a Patreon button if you'd like to help me make these videos. every little bit helps in making these better and better. Special thanks, of course, to Pixel Bush Entertainment for allowing me to give my opinions on, well, their opinions. I do occasionally enjoy getting into a bit of a discussion, and this felt like something that I'd actually enjoy weighing in on. So, with that being said, I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.